And speaking of banned books, our congregational story this morning will be "And Tango Makes Three," which was really one of the original gay children's books and has unfortunately been banned again in some places. And it is by Justin Richardson and Peter Parnell. And it's illustrated by Henry Cole, but unfortunately I do not have slides for large pictures for you all this morning. So we'll have to use our imaginations. In the middle of New York City, there is a great big park called Central Park. Children love to play there. It has a toy boat pond where they can sail their boats. It has a carousel to ride on in summer and an ice rink to skate on in the winter. But best of all, it has its very own zoo. Each day, families of all kinds go to visit the animals that live there. But children and their parents aren't the only families at the zoo. The animals make families too. There are red panda bear families with mothers and fathers, and furry red panda bear cubs. There are monkey dads and monkey moms raising noisy monkey babies. There are toad families and toucan families and cotton-top tamarin families too. And in the penguin house, there are penguin families. Every year at the same time, the girl penguins start noticing the boy penguins, and the boy penguins start noticing the girls. And sometimes when the right girl and the right boy penguin find each other, they become a couple. Two penguins in the penguin house were a little bit different. One was named Roy, and the other was named Silo. Now, Roy and Silo were both boys, but they did everything together. They bowed to each other, they sang to each other, and they walked together and they swam together. Wherever Roy went, Silo went too. They didn't spend a lot of time with the girl penguins, and the girl penguins didn't spend a lot of time with them. Roy and Silo wound their necks around each other. Their keeper, Mr. Gramsci, noticed the two penguins, and he thought to himself, "Oh, well, they must be in love." Roy and Silo watched how the other penguins made a home. So they built a nest of stones for themselves. Every night, Roy and Silo slept there together just like the other penguin couples. And every morning, Roy and Silo woke up together. But one day, Roy and Silo saw that the other couples did something that they could not. The mama penguin would lay an egg. She and the papa penguin would take turns keeping the egg warm until finally it would hatch and there would be a baby penguin. Roy and Silo had no egg to sit on and keep warm. They had no baby chick to feed and cuddle and love. Their nest was very nice, but it was still empty. One day, Roy found something that looked like what the other penguins were hatching, and he brought it to their nest. It was only a rock. But Silo carefully sat on it, and sat, and sat. When Silo got sleepy, he slept. And when Silo was done sleeping and sitting, he swam, and then Roy sat. Day after day, Roy and Silo sat on that rock. But nothing happened. Then Mr. Gramsci got an idea. He found an egg that needed to be cared for, and he brought it to Roy and Silo's nest. They knew just what to do. They moved the egg to the center of their nest. Every day they turned it so each side stayed warm. Some days Roy sat while Silo went for food, and other days it was Silo's turn to take care of the egg. They sat in the morning and they sat at night. They sat through lunchtime and swim time and supper. They sat at the beginning of the month and the end of the month and all of the days in between. Until one day they heard a sound coming from inside their egg. Beep, 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 beep. It said, And Roy and Silo called back, "Squawk, squawk." I don't know what penguins sound like, I'm sorry, y'all. "Peep, peep," answered the egg. Suddenly, a tiny hole appeared in the eggshell. And then there was a giant crack, and out came their very own baby. She had fuzzy white feathers and a funny little black beak. Now Roy and Silo were fathers. "We'll call her Tango," Mr. Gramsci said, "because it takes two to make a tango." Roy and Silo taught Tango how to sing for them when she was hungry, and they fed her food from their beaks. They snuggled her in their nest at night. Tango was the very first penguin in a zoo to have two daddies. Soon Tango grew strong enough to leave the nest. Roy and Silo took her for a swim, just like all the other penguin families. And all the children who came to the zoo could see Tango and her two fathers playing in the penguin house with the other penguins. "Hooray, Roy! Hooray, Silo! And welcome, Tango!" they cheered. At night, the three penguins returned to their nest. There they snuggled together, and like all the other penguins in the penguin house, and all the other animals in the zoo, and all the other families in the city around them, they went to sleep. The end. So you all may have noticed that Unitarian Universalists have a certain reputation for being passionate about social justice. And I am going to talk about disability justice and queer activism in this sermon, but this is more a story of how I got there. So first, I'm actually going to tell you the story of my very first petition, which had absolutely nothing to do with any of that. I don't know if elementary schools do this here, but my school had a school fair every year. I don't think there were actually any rides at all. I think it was just like carnival games, and there was like a rubber duck race, and there were prizes. And one of the prizes every year was goldfish in bags. Now, when I was a small child, I spent a lot of time at the local pet store. So I knew that it was not very safe to keep a goldfish in a small plastic bag for hours. And I knew a bunch of statistics about like prize fish surviving their prize fish experiences. Please don't ask me for those facts now, because I'm sure like 5-year-old me could answer you, but I have no idea now. But after seeing these goldfish at the carnival, I knew that I needed to protect their Piscean siblings. I don't know why I knew what a petition was, but I made one, and I got all of my classmates to sign it. And I also got the aforementioned local pet store to agree to give out certificates for free goldfish as prizes instead. So I presented the petition and the plan to the principal of the school, and she said yes. I'm not actually sure the petition part was necessary. The school carnival started giving out gift certificates. The pet store presumably made a profit from families who suddenly needed to buy fish supplies, and no further goldfish were harmed at our school. To people who know me now, this might sound like a very characteristic story. But actually, that was my first and last organizing campaign until I was about 29. I'm not saying I didn't care about social issues at all. You know, I voted regularly, I worked for education nonprofits, but the closest I got to activism was attending a Prop 8 rally one time. As this might perhaps suggest, in some ways I had a very privileged upbringing. Although I attended a series of diverse public schools, I personally had very little understanding of social class or finances until late high school. My exposure to the systemic racism that was at work in the education and policing systems in Chicago in particular at that time was likewise delayed. I didn't really know much about it at all until I took a creative writing class senior year, and a couple of Black classmates told me about their experiences. Our high school would later be sued for the racially prejudiced tracking system that was used to sort students into honors classes at that time. That gives you an idea. And yet, in other ways, my upbringing was characterized by a number of harsh and undeniable realities. My family had a history of generational trauma that made my own childhood quite fraught. And then, too, I grew up as a closeted queer teenager in a community that wasn't very accepting. Although Evanston, Illinois, prided itself on liberalism, it had significant limits. The community theoretically supported gay people, but that often just meant that it wasn't acceptable to use outright slurs, and there was some tepid support for civil unions, and gay people were briefly mentioned in a sex ed class one time. No one, for the most part, seemed to actually know anyone gay, and certainly not anyone trans. When the local synagogue once held a lesbian commitment ceremony, it was talked about for weeks. And in a high school of over 3,000 people, only 3 of my peers felt safe enough to come out while we were there. I experienced any number of unpleasant comments and situations, but one in particular sticks out to me now. Aside from the death penalty, the most popular school-sanctioned debate topic was the question of civil unions. Should they be legal, or was that an immoral, slippery slope? It was the first time that I was asked to calmly debate the validity of my own existence in a classroom, but it would not be the last nor the worst. Years later, in an ethics class at Bryn Mawr College, we would study the debate between Harriet McBride Johnson, a disabled lawyer and activist, and Peter Singer, a utilitarian ethicist. Singer believes, still, in an argument that could easily have been listed wholesale directly from an early 1900s eugenics pamphlet, that it is morally permissible to murder disabled babies who are born with significant genetic disorders and have a lower quality of life and are a burden to their families, like Harriet McBride Johnson, or like me. I would be asked to debate the topic in class. Should I have been killed as a child for the betterment of society? 2 sides, both equally valid. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The one exception to the homophobia that I experienced as a teenager was the Unitarian Universalist Church, where I attended youth group activities which had a giant rainbow flag on the wall of the nursery. I didn't explicitly talk to anyone there about my own identity, but it didn't matter. In a community where, in an echo of the logic of the eugenics movement, the fitness of gay people to raise children or live normal lives was constantly questioned, this was the one place that I felt fully accepted. That flag got me through to Bryn Mawr, where being queer was significantly more acceptable, and I was able to come out as bi, although for me personally that wasn't the full truth of about my sexuality. Once I graduated, I moved to downtown Philadelphia, and I became a member of First Church, where I met my first serious girlfriend. Bryn Mawr was also the place that I first learned that I was disabled. Although I wouldn't be formally diagnosed until I was 27 or so, I have a genetic condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that causes the collagen in my body to form abnormally and affects everything from my joints to my teeth to my heart. When I was 19, the damage to my joints caught up to me. I was bedridden for a semester and in a lot of pain, doing intensive physical therapy and going back and forth from the hospital. Although no one quite knew what was wrong, I did eventually recover enough to finish school. Because I didn't have a diagnosis, I did not receive any formal accommodations whatsoever. I did, however, begin to understand that I was disabled, even if no one said it. But I still wasn't an activist, and I wasn't interested in ministry for that matter. I worked in theater, and then I wound up in AmeriCorps as a grant writer for a social services nonprofit. Eventually, getting frustrated with the way that many nonprofits were being run, I decided to apply to what was a relatively new degree at that time, a master's in nonprofit leadership at the University of Pennsylvania. I wanted to become a consultant and show nonprofits how to be more efficient. One of my favorite classes was accounting, by the way. It's been a minute. So how did I wind up in seminary? Well, the tidy version of the story, the one that I often tell, is that while I was working towards my master's, I was volunteering in RE at First Church. And when our staffer left, I became the part-time coordinator of religious education. By the time I graduated, I was much more excited about religious education than I was about running a nonprofit. And that's true. But the other truth is that my symptoms worsened around that time, and I became very, very ill. I slowly lost the energy to do much of anything besides drag myself to class and maybe church. I managed to graduate, but afterwards I was trying to work full-time for a nonprofit that only really begrudgingly granted me accommodations. And I was in a state where I just could not access adequate medical care despite having excellent insurance. So really, I moved to Massachusetts less to pursue a career and more so that I could work half-time and receive medical care. Nevertheless, once I was in Boston, I did find a job as a director of religious education, and I truly did love that work in a way that I had never quite loved fundraising. I liked fundraising. I also finally received a diagnosis, which eventually led to receiving medication, a rollator, and other supports. And equally importantly, I finally began to spend some time around other disabled people. It wasn't that I had never had disabled friends, but they were few and far between, and we didn't necessarily talk about disability much. But fairly shortly after moving here, I joined the Disability Oversight Board of the MBTA, because I really loved public transit, and a whole new world opened up. Suddenly, I was in rooms where being disabled was the norm, and I was learning that we had rights and a community and history, much the way I had learned about queerness at Bryn Mawr. Early on, I was taken to a talk by Judy Heumann, who I think even most non-disabled folks have heard of by this point. At the reception, she asked all of the female activists using mobility devices in the room to come join her for a picture. I did not move, and she pointedly waved me over. "Oh, I'm not an activist," I protested. "Well," she said, "you're here, aren't you?" And as it turned out, she was right. I went to seminary because I hoped to become a minister of religious education, but things didn't quite happen that way. Attending the Boston University School of Theology was both one of the best and worst experiences of my life. And keep in mind, one of the symptoms of my disorder is uncontrollable vomiting that semi-routinely lands me in the hospital, so, you know, high bar. When I started at STH, there was shockingly little knowledge about disability. And people, including professors, would routinely accidentally use slurs in class or touch my rollator without permission. BU is also one of the most notoriously physically inaccessible campuses in the country. My first week, I was late to class because it took me 10 minutes to use the winding accessible path between two buildings that everyone else could go between in like 30 seconds. And I ended up crying through chapel. But I was not alone. With the support of 3 of my disabled classmates, one of whom, by the way, is now making good trouble as a UU Parish minister in Florida, we founded BU's first student disability club. With the UU student group, we staged a walk that was covered by the student paper, demonstrating the aforementioned path. And with disabled students at the law school, we wrote a letter to the president's office asking for a temporary ramp at least, so that the wheelchair users we'd invited to some disability events at our respective schools could realistically get around or go to the bathroom. The leader of the law students and I may have been called into our respective dean's offices after some angry phone calls from the president. The deans were very supportive. I preached my first ever sermon that week in Marsh Chapel from the floor, because that pulpit, like the one behind me now, was not designed with the idea that someone like me would ever use it. I wish I could say that UU spaces were better. And the UUs at BU were a tremendous source of support for me with the aforementioned activities. But the truth is that the year that I arrived at BU, I almost left Unitarian Universalism altogether over my persistent experiences of ableism. I've run into locked and non-functional elevators and lifts, meeting spaces that had no chairs, and congregations that just aren't accessible at all. At one point as a DRE, I was asked to leave my rollator outside of the sanctuary as it would be visually distracting. None of this is an uncommon experience for disabled UUs, I'm sorry to say, and many stories are much worse than my own. And beyond our congregations, UUs so quick to involve ourselves with social justice causes have, until very recently, been notably silent on disability issues. And, of course, there are the pulpits. As I've said in nearly every diversity essay I have ever written, as a queer woman, I would feel comfortable preaching from any UU pulpit in the world. As a disabled one, there are very few from which I could physically do so. Now, as you can obviously tell, I decided to stay and try to change things for the better. But I started to wonder why things were so bad in the first place. Why was such a progressive denomination so behind on disability rights? I started to suspect that first year at BU that part of the answer lay in our historical involvement with the eugenics movement, which I was just beginning to study. I knew the basic story of eugenics from my activist friends, and I knew that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who wrote the most notorious pro-eugenics Supreme Court decision in American history, was a Unitarian. And I quickly discovered that this was not a fluke, and that both Unitarians and Universalists had been heavily and enthusiastically involved in supporting eugenics in both America and Britain. I became convinced that Unitarian Universalism needed something like a truth and reconciliation process around eugenics, and really I've been pursuing that goal ever since. That first year, I wrote my first paper about eugenics, and I entered that aforementioned sermon into Equal Access's sermon contest, where it won. My second year, I had the chance to intern with Equal Access, which is the disability justice organization associated with the UUA. And I conducted an ethnographic research study about disabled religious professionals' experiences of ableism. My third year, I got a grant to conduct archival research at the Wellcome Library in London, and I wrote a directed study on the very strange phenomenon I had discovered of queer disabled Unitarian women who nonetheless supported eugenics. And more relevantly, I presented my more general research on Unitarians, Universalist, and eugenics at General Assembly in Portland, where I also served as co-lead of the Disability Caucus, which is its own activism story that we're not going to get into right now. The rest you all more or less know, since I have been your ministerial intern since shortly after graduation. And I am, by the way, very grateful to this community for finally getting me involved with a little bit of queer advocacy as well, in speaking at and helping to plan Canton's second ever Pride and first Trans Day of Remembrance events. Alongside my work here in Canton, as many of you know, I am now the Vice President of Equal Access, and I have been recently named to the new UUA Accountability Launch Team, where I'll be serving as the liaison to the Values and Resources Working Group of the board. I'm sorry, it's such a long name, which examines issues such as the ethics of our budget, divestment, and reparations, including potentially for eugenics. And most of all, I am finally, for a whole host of reasons, immensely hopeful about the future of disability within Unitarian Universalism. I was taught at seminary in my UU preaching class to end sermons with a call to action, and I do have one for you this morning. I want to stress that while it is true that I have very quickly become kind of the expert on Unitarian Universalism and the eugenics movement, this really is not because I am a brilliant historian. It is mostly because very few other people, and certainly no one else disabled I know of, was studying this topic at all when I started. I wasn't the world's most brilliant disability activist at BU either, given that I was a complete beginner, although I did have some good advisors, and I like to think I do know what I'm doing now, but this is 5 years later. Mostly, I just tried, and I was there. When I sum up my life 10 years from now, I doubt that I'll say that I'm not an activist any longer, nor that I've given up ministry. I think it's probably a little late for that. But I do hope that I will be able to say that I am no longer anything like the expert on Unitarian Universalism, disability, and eugenics, because so many other historians and activists will have picked up the baton. So try, even if you're a beginner. Learn about our history, learn about disability justice and trans rights and anti-racism. Have those uncomfortable conversations. And finally, please be careful with your goldfish.